Alrighty, so welcome back and thanks again for coming. So our collector this week is someone who came up as an associate of our most recent collector, Maurice Bizot. So it is another French collector, and we only have 2 of his specimens here at Tennessee so far. And here's one of them. They are both specimens from this herbarium of F.A. McFadden. So they've been hand copied over from another label. They're always, like always, not the easiest to read. But you can see our collector here, our LEG, is this looks like J, but it's actually I, Thériot. And he was collecting this moss specimen in, this is actually Frühling, which is German for spring, of 1912. And the specimen does not look like it, but it's actually part of an Hexacoti set, which you can see down here at the bottom, abbreviated. It's actually the mosses of Europe and America. And I can show you what the original label for this specimen would have looked like. So the more formal Hexacoti sort of format. The editor is this Edwin Bauer, who was German. He was a German botanist and geneticist. And so that's why some of the labels in German and not in French, like you might expect. So the specimen was collected in, this is Le Havre, which is a port city in the Normandy region of northern France. As a side note, they have a salamander wearing a crown on a bed of flames on their coat of arms, which I thought was pretty rad. So this section is kind of hard to read. So again, I'll show you the original specimen label here, which this is again German, that roughly translates to on landslides or possibly cracks in the earth on the foot of the promontory called Eve, which I'm pretty sure refers to the Cap de la Eve, which is a cape or a point right here on the water. And as you can see here in this picture, here it's right next to that city, and it has a lighthouse. I think there's a World War II bunker somewhere, and it's got a lot of hiking along these pretty cliffs where our moss was presumably collected. So the specimen here is, you can see a small little moss with some sporophytes. It was identified as Herbarium bicolor Nova variety events, which again is kind of hard to read, so it is easier to see on the original label. This Nova var actually means that it's a new variety, and here this THER tells us that it's actually a new taxon that was described by Thériot himself. And this variety name events, I'm assuming relates to that Cap de Eve location where he found it. So I couldn't find any pictures of this particular variety out in the wild, but here's a couple pictures of just Herbarium bicolor. So probably looks pretty similar when it's fresh. So one major source of information on this collector that I found was a memorial article in the journal The Bryologist from 1952. It was in French, but it was written by, if you look down here, Maurice Bizot. And he says they never actually met in person, but they corresponded and exchanged a lot of specimens, and that Thériot was one of his mentors. So Thériot, his full name was Marie Hippolyte Irénée Thériot, but he seems to have gone mainly by Irénée Thériot, which I think is very reasonable. He was born in Soulaincourt, which is in, sorry, I'm losing my place, northeastern France. Where is that? I'm sorry. Okay, now northeastern France in 1859. And regretfully, I couldn't find any pictures of him, sadly. He was orphaned at the very young age of 7, but followed in his late father's footsteps and trained to become a teacher. So for 5 years, he taught at a school in the Department of Sarthe. And in 1888, he became director of the upper primary school in Le Havre, which is where our specimen was collected, and where he would work until his retirement from education over 30 years later in 1920. So while his main career was education, he was interested in botany and specifically in bryology from a very young age, and he collected and studied mosses in his spare time throughout his life. He was encouraged in his pursuits by Louis Corbier, who was another French botanist who also worked as a school teacher and had written a flora of the Normandy region. He described his first new species in the moss genus Physidens in 1888 when he was 28, or 1887 when he was 28 years old. He was supported in his studies by other French botanists and corresponded and exchanged specimens with a large network of researchers. He continued to collect and study bryophytes in France, but he also branched out to publish on mosses from North America, Mexico, Chile, China, Australasia, Tunisia, and other regions all around the world. He amassed a unique and important collection of type specimens and became a member of the French Botanical Society. He agreed in 1939 to transfer ownership of his personal herbarium to the National Museum of Natural History, with an agreement that he could keep it until he passed away. And it was endangered by the German occupation and bombing that went on during World War II. Thériot actually wrote in a letter to M. Bizot about his concerns, and he said that he wasn't able to get it moved to Paris because they couldn't find transportation. And at that point, it filled 100 boxes and weighed between 450 and 500 kilograms, which is over 1,000 pounds. And during the liberation of France, he was also really worried what was going to happen. The town he lived in was evacuated, but he wanted to stay to protect his herbarium. And it said that since they were technically property of the National Museum, he considered himself to be a guardian of national property. Thankfully, the herbarium was not damaged in that conflict and eventually was transported safely to Paris, where it is housed today. So he continued to study, to work on and study mosses until his early 80s. There's actually a really great quote from a letter that he wrote to Bizot in 1943. And so I will read you the Google translated version of it, where he said, "Like you, but obviously for other reasons, I find myself further and further away from bryology. In particular, the lack of coal does not allow me to heat my laboratory. And on the other hand, my eyes are aging and make certain microscopic studies difficult for me. What do you want? I have to resign myself to it, and I resign myself to it. When I was 50 years old, I said to myself, if I reach 80 years old, I will give up microscopic observations. And I am 83 years old, and I have not yet said the final farewell to my dear mosses. I therefore recognize myself as a privileged person." So he continued to work, but he passed away just 4 years later at the age of 87. So during his life, Thériot described more than 1,000 new species and several new genera representing mosses from around the world. His publications are included in almost 150 issues of both French and international journals. There's one genus, Thériot was named in his honor, along with over 30 species and varieties of mosses. Specimen-wise, I found over 500 in the Bryophyte portal, just 2 in the Lichen portal, 1 in Cernek. There are at least 1,000 specimens in GBIF that he collected, and I found 300 plus his collections, 5,000 plus that were from his personal herbarium or identified by him in the PC herbarium, but I expect there's a lot more out there. So that is Irénée Thériot, and I'll end again with a short quote from M. Bizot, who said, Thériot was always a man of common sense, of great scientific probity, and whose life can serve as an example of energy, love of work, and continuity of effort to rising generations. So another interesting French bryologist who was lucky enough to get to pursue his interests for most of his long life. So he was very productive. And thank you again for listening.